The room smells of iron and sweat. Oil lamps gutter in the draft. A patient lies on a table of hard wood, legs tied with coarse rope. His eyes are wide and very alive while the room around him moves with a peculiar, practiced violence. Instruments clink. A handkerchief is pressed to a mouth. There is shouting, orders barked fast so that the surgeon's knife can be quicker than the human scream. The light catches glistening blade and warmer, darker stains on linen. There is no softening of the sentence. The act of surgery is performed under the strict rule that speed is mercy, and brutality is, painfully, strategy. This is how many, though not all, operations in the long era before reliable anesthetics were remembered and described. A choreography of restraint, steadiness, and made-fast instruments, practiced by people whose hands had learned a peculiar, merciless economy. The surgeon's skill was measured in inches per second, and in the steadiness with which the heart of a terrified man or woman could be cut and closed before their strength gave out. Pain was not a misfortune to be alleviated. It was a constant condition to be outrun. This fierce economy of movement, of doing the cruel thing swiftly so that it would be brief, defined a whole clinical world. Contemporary observers and later historians have insisted on the emotional and physical cost of that world. The terror of patients, the stoic or hardened expressions of practitioners, the rituals of distraction and sedation that were, at best, partial. The surgical theater of this era was a place where human courage and human terror met at the edge of a blade. Why did medicine allow such scenes to continue into the modern century? The answer is partly technological, partly cultural, partly epistemic. For centuries, the tools of cutting and stopping bleeding had improved only slowly. Antisepsis and effective monitoring were not yet available, so the calculus of risk looked very different. A surgeon could shorten the time of agony but not yet reliably prevent death from infection, shock, or hemorrhage. Cultural attitudes toward pain also mattered. In many societies, suffering had theological and moral overtones. In learned medical circles, a certain stoicism was prized. Practical remedies existed. Opium in its many forms, strong drink, herbal poultices, or local applications that dulled rather than abolished sensation. None of these, however, offered the promise of complete insensibility for a major operation. If one listens closely to the scattered accounts from the late 18th century and the first half of the 19th, another truth emerges. Even in those dark rooms, people were looking for a different possibility. The instruments of restraint and the credo of haste were not unchallenged practices. They were, in the minds of some, temporary and intolerable compromises. The appetite for an answer to surgical pain would come to be one of the great engines of 19th century medical innovation. It would be driven by curiosity as much as by compassion, by the conviction that if the human body could be made to sleep without dying, then medicine could be remade. The first hints of such a possibility came not from hospital amphitheaters, but from curious closets and convivial salons, where chemists and amateur experimenters inhaled gases for amusement and inquiry. At the close of the long 18th century, a handful of men who were as much philosophers as scientists began to probe what certain airs, as they called gases, did to the human mind and to sensation. Joseph Priestley identified several gases. Humphry Davy, a natural philosopher of considerable range and daring, undertook careful experiments with nitrous oxide and published his observations at the turn of the 19th century. Davy spoke of exhilaration and of altered consciousness. He also, importantly, suggested that nitrous oxide could, in specific circumstances, relieve the pains of surgical operations. It was an observation recorded in the neat, empirical prose of chemical research, but its implication was incalculable. Here was, perhaps, an agent that could blunt suffering where knives had once been the only remedy. The idea took time to translate from laboratory note to clinical practice, but its appearance on paper opened a new conceptual space for medicine. These early experiments were social as well as scientific. The inhalation of nitrous oxide became a form of genteel entertainment in some circles, a party trick turned amateur inquiry. Men and women gathered to test the limits of sensation and to note, with an odd mixture of laughter and observation, what the air did to the body. From such evenings rose a practical, if halting, interest among those who worked with teeth and with wound care. Dentists who had to extract without possession of scalpels quick enough to spare the worst of the patient's suffering. Surgeons with little ability to stave off the shock and misery of a patient's agony. The path from inhalatory carnival to clinical tool was neither straight nor inevitable, but the social practices made the physics familiar. Gases could be carried into the lungs. They could change the threshold of sensation. They could, sometimes, render a person less responsive to pain. Yet the transition from curiosity to accepted practice required more than chemical plausibility. It needed demonstration. The medical world of the early 19th century, local, institutional, argumentative, demanded proof that could be observed and repeated. Inventors and practitioners who hoped to change the face of surgery had to persuade colleagues who were naturally cautious, sometimes hostile, and often invested in existing methods. They had to transform an oddity of salons into a reproducible clinical technique. That translation, when it came, would depend on a constellation of individuals: the experimental chemist who noted an effect, the dentist or operator who tried to harness it, the surgeon who consented to allow an experiment in the amphitheater. And always, running through the work like vein through stone, was the public dimension of such experiments, the need to show, in front of clients, students, and skeptical colleagues, that the menace of surgical pain could be controlled. Before that translation arrived in full, however, the world of surgery continued to rotate on the old axis. Consider the instruments themselves: saws and knives, clamps and curiosity. A surgeon in a provincial town might perform an amputation in a cottage under a rushlight. A more prestigious hospital might stage an amphitheater operation attended by students and the curious. In both places, the rituals were similar. The patient might be given a strong drink, and helpers would be ready to bind and to hold. There are accounts, in diaries and in hospital notes, of men and women who chose particular forms of death rather than submit to drawn-out operations. There are also accounts of astonishing endurance, of people who, trembling, bore incisions for the sake of life. It is tempting to imagine that clinical detachment was merely cruelty. More often, it was a form of psychological armor, a cultural technology that allowed a profession and a public to do what they thought necessary. Yet that armor did little to answer the question that would become central for medicine and for society. Could pain itself be abolished during incision, cautery, and suturing? The answer came not as an instantaneous miracle, but as a sequence of experiments, conversations, and demonstrations carried out across taverns, dental offices, and hospital corridors. Names would later cluster around those efforts, some celebrated, some embattled, some forgotten, and with them would come stories of triumph and dispute. Before the world learned a name for what was changing it, there were only practices. The gamblers hoped that a new gas might succeed where a cup of brandy failed, the technical tinkering with masks and mouthpieces. The patient's trembling trust that a stranger's promise of relief might mean what it said. By the middle of the 19th century, a century that could be said to lean forward impatiently toward progress, the pieces of the puzzle were in place for a radical change. The experiments of the previous decades had taught important lessons about volatility, potency, and the need for careful dosing. They had also taught a less technical but no less vital lesson: that the idea of pain as an immutable condition was false. Pain could be modulated. The threshold of human sensation was not a law of God, but a variable to be explored. That realization transformed the question from theoretical curiosity into moral and professional imperative. If one could keep a patient alive and still quiet the body's protest, surgery would not simply be less cruel. It could be reimagined in scale and ambition. And so the narrative moves forward, from rooms of restraint and practices of speed to laboratories of curiosity and salons of inhalation. The stage is being set for a public and demonstrable answer. The dark theater of early surgery, which had been the default human condition for ages, begins to feel, to those who study such things, like a temporary arrangement awaiting a new technique. In the ears of clinicians and laypeople alike there grows a question that will carry the story onward. What will happen the first time a surgeon cuts a living body and the patient feels nothing? The world was on the brink of learning the answer. In the hush that follows these new ideas, one can imagine the small conversations, a dentist's cautious note, a chemist's ledger, a surgeon's skeptical frown that precede revolution. The history of anesthetic practice does not explode into being. It accumulates moment by moment, inhalation by inhalation, refusal by refusal, until the old rituals can no longer be sustained. The question moves from marginal speculation to central urgent pursuit. The theater where speed was law waits, unknowingly, for the quieting breath that will remake it. They met for pleasure and experiment in rooms that stank of wax, spirits, and curiosity. Picture a mid-size hall in a provincial town, a family drawing room in a city, an itinerant showman's stage in a market square. Chairs are pushed back, a fiddler perhaps plays, the lamplight pools on faces eager for spectacle. Into this social scene, a clear glass retort exhales a thin, shimmering vapor, and for a few moments the ordinary rules of the body loosen. Laughter rises, confessions tumble out, some fall quiet and dreamy. These were the gatherings where the strange powers of certain airs were first noticed not as arcane curiosities, but as phenomena that touched the human capacity to feel. The story of these gatherings begins with men who might now be called natural philosophers, but who in their time moved between chemistry, medicine, and a broader public life. At the close of the 18th century, a particular figure stands in the dim front rank, Humphry Davy, who in a series of self-administered experiments cataloged the effects of nitrous oxide and described, in precise, astonished sentences, sensations of exhilaration, dulled pain, and altered perception. Davy wrote up his researches, and in doing so, planted an idea that would germinate unevenly for decades, that a harmless-seeming air might change the threshold of human sensation, and crucially, blunt the sting of pain. His notebooks read like the reports of a man who was at once a chemist and an observer of human vulnerability, and his published account offered a careful but provocative suggestion that this gas might one day be used to mitigate the suffering caused by surgical operations. In the years that followed, nitrous oxide moved back and forth between the salons of polite society and the parlors of popular entertainment. It became, for a time, a fashionable diversion. Laughing gas parties where volunteers inhaled the gas and became the living evidence of a new oddity. The shows were at once social spectacle and practical demonstration. Among the men who saw such entertainments were practitioners whose daily work obliged them to confront pain, dentists. They watched and they wondered. If a young man could jump from a bench and bruise his knees without later remembering the pain, might not a patient sit through the ruthless extraction of a tooth as through a minor inconvenience? The thought moved from idle wonder to determined experiment in a few cases, and the gap between amusement and medicine began to narrow. One of those practitioners was a Connecticut dentist whose name would survive controversy and tragedy, Horace Wells. He encountered nitrous oxide at a public exhibition one cold December evening, and what he saw changed him. The next day he inhaled the gas himself and allowed a colleague to remove a troublesome tooth. He reported afterwards that the sensation was not pain but a mere prick. In his memory, the cut was little different from a pinprick. Encouraged, he used nitrous oxide in his practice and invited others to observe the result. Wells moved from a private conviction to an attempt at public demonstration when, a few weeks after his initial success, he traveled to larger assemblages of physicians and dentists to show that tooth extraction could be made bearable by gas inhalation. The demonstrations were irregular in their outcomes. One public trial in a Boston venue failed to convince some observers, and Wells's career thereafter braided triumph with professional frustration. Yet his experiments marked an important turning point. The notion that inhaled air could be harnessed deliberately to blunt procedural pain was now being tested in clinical contexts rather than spoken of only among the amused. Beyond the personal stories, the technology of inhalation itself required a kind of improvisational engineering. Early practitioners were not provided with pre-made masks or calibrated vaporizers. They adapted bellows, paper cones, and crude mouthpieces. They learned by trial and error the balance between too little, which offered no relief, and too much, which could depress breathing or lead to collapse. The gases themselves posed challenges. Nitrous oxide required careful generation and storage. Ether and other volatile liquids raised concerns about flammability and about the unpredictability of their effects on different bodies. These practical obstacles made the experimenters both bold and cautious. Their tinkering, a dentist's leather bag here, a chemist's wineglass there, was the low, manual precursor of a scientific discipline that would one day standardize equipment and dosing. In these early years, the work resembled craft as much as it did laboratory science. At the same time, other airs were being noticed. Ether, a volatile liquid known in various forms since long before the 19th century, had been used in different contexts for its intoxicating properties. Some individuals experimented with ether in recreational settings in ways that paralleled nitrous oxide frolics. There are, moreover, accounts of surgeons and physicians who, observing the social uses of these agents, began to test them for clinical ends. One such clinical use, recorded in the southern states of North America in the early 1840s, involved ether administered in a private surgery to remove a tumor from the neck of a patient. The surgeon who later described this operation delayed publishing his account, and the episode would remain a vexed point in later disputes about priority for some years. The essential point for our narrative is not who spoke first, but that by the middle years of the decade, the experimental idea had shifted into the realm of actual surgical practice. Men and women were no longer merely inhaling for amusement. They were trying to silence pain in earnest. Social meaning attended these experiments. To inhale a gas in the privacy of a drawing room was one kind of gesture. To breathe it in the presence of a surgeon's scalpel was another. The first, often staged as entertainment, implied novelty and playfulness. The second implied agency and moral choice. When dentists and other operators began to harness gases for analgesia, they were making a claim about human dignity as well as medical technique. The claim was radical in its implication, that the suffering of the body could be made negotiable, that the physician's moral imagination must include the alleviation of pain, not simply the cure of disease. This claim met with skepticism. Some clinicians worried that anesthesia would mask the signs surgeons used to judge health. Others feared the strange gases themselves. Religious voices sometimes objected on moral grounds, suggesting that suffering had a proper role as spiritual test or social sanction. Yet, as the experiments multiplied, such objections became harder to sustain in the face of simple empirical success. Where the gas worked, the patient was calmer. Where the patient was calmer, more careful and ambitious operation could be attempted. The sequences of success and failure in these years also produced a specific dramaturgy. There were nights of triumph in small surgical offices where a patient emerged tranquil from a long extraction. There were public trials where the gas fell short, and the audience murmured its doubt. The tension was not only technical but reputational. Whose credibility would the scientific world accept? How were demonstrations to be conducted so that a skeptical peer group might be convinced? These questions pushed the experimenters to perform not only medicine, but also persuasion. They learned rather quickly that a laboratory note or an isolated triumph was less persuasive than a deliberate, public procedure in an institutional setting. And so the scene shifts from convivial halls to waiting rooms and to the margins of operating amphitheaters. The improvisations of showmen and the courage of a handful of dentists had created a road that led toward the hospital, but not yet into it with confidence. A question began to pull at every curious mind. When would an inhaled agent be used where the knife cut deeper and the risk was greater, when the stakes transcended a tooth and touched life itself? The gradual answer lay in the conjunction of better prepared gases, improved methods of administration, and crucially, the willingness of a surgeon to allow the experiment in front of patients and colleagues. That moment of institutional demonstration was still to come, for now the work continued in pockets, in a Hartford dental parlor, in a chemist's laboratory, in a physician's private rooms. Each test a small claim against the old inevitability of surgical pain. We should not romanticize these early years as simple progress. The experiments with nitrous oxide and with ether carried dangers that the experimenters sometimes only half understood. Errors in dosing could lead to collapse, impurities in gas preparation could cause harm, and in that time before systematic clinical trials, anecdotes and testimonials could be misleading. Yet these very imperfections made the experiments publicly legible. They forced practitioners to document, to repeat, and to refine. The apparatus of medicine, journals, meetings, peer testimony began to gather around the problem of analgesia as if around an unclosed wound. Patients, too, became part of the experiment in a way that modern ethics would find uncomfortable. Their bodies were, at times, the site where hope and mistake met. We must keep this discomfort in view, for it shapes the moral contour of the narrative that follows. Toward the close of the period, a new clarity emerged in the conversations among clinicians. The question was no longer only whether gases could dull pain. It had become, rather, which agent could be delivered safely, predictably, and on the scale demanded by serious surgery. Men like Wells had shown that nitrous oxide could blunt the pain of extraction. Others, working with ether, hinted at a deeper potential. The next scene, the one that would move the experiment from scattered offices into large institutional amphitheaters, would require a demonstration that was both clinical and spectacle, one that could not be shrugged aside as an isolated curiosity. Already, in the notes and letters that passed among surgeons, dentists, and chemists, the outlines of such a demonstration were being sketched. A willing patient, a trusted operator, and a witness list large enough to make the results undeniable. In the interim, the world of pain began very quietly to change. It was a slow, unbelieving motion, a dentist's bold inhalation, a chemist's ledger, a showman's table. A patient who slept through a cut and woke up puzzled to find the wound had been closed. Each instance was small, each was freighted with contingency. But the accumulation of these small moments, of successful extractions and failed public trials, of improvisation and measured observation, was the true engine of the coming revolution. The breath that would quiet the surgical theater was being learned, one inhalation at a time. The amphitheater waited like a breath held too long. Sunlight filtered through the high windows of the great dome, pooling on tiered benches and the worn boards of the surgeon's platform. Students and citizens filled the rows. Some had come for instruction, some for curiosity, and some because news had traveled through the city that something remarkable might be shown. Outside, the streets of Boston carried their usual trade and rumor, but inside the building time seemed to thicken, as if the room itself had been charged with expectation. On that clear autumn morning, the assembling bodies were at once the audience and the instrument of history, witnesses whose surprised faces would make the event transmissible beyond the hospital walls. At the center of the scene stood a man who was not yet a figure in medical history, but who had learned, in his own small, stubborn way, to turn chemistry into a kind of craft. William Thomas Green Morton had trained as a dentist. He was a practitioner whose world consisted of chair, extraction, and the intimate, painful encounters that mark dental work. He had also cultivated acquaintances among chemists and geologists, men who could offer him vials and recipes, and, on occasion, instruction in the use of volatile substances. Morton's experiments had not been solitary flights of genius. They were the product of careful, repeated trial, of borrowed knowledge, and of conversation by lamplight. He had, in the months before the grand demonstration, used a volatile ether in dental cases and had refined a simple apparatus, a mouthpiece and a reservoir, that he believed could deliver the agent in a controllable way. The apparatus was crude by later standards, but it was, for its moment, invention enough. The patient chosen for the public test was a young man whose name would later be used as an emblem of the day, Edward Gilbert Abbott. He had been admitted with a vascular growth beneath his jaw, a condition that would occasionally be treated by excision, but which, in the pre-anesthetic era, involved a torment both for patient and operator. Abbott's records tell us that he consented to a trial of the new method. That consent itself was a small but weighty drama, for it required a willing surrender of the body to a method not yet formalized, a trust in a breath, and in an instrument held by a man not yet famous. Around the patient the surgeons prepared, hands practiced in speed but now asked to act with a different muscle, restraint. When Morton brought the etherized breath to Abbott's lips, instructing him to breathe slowly and deeply, something nearly simple happened, and yet nothing in medicine felt quite the same thereafter. Within a few inhalations the young man's eyes dulled, his muscles slackened, and the surface of his response to pain withdrew. The surgeon's knife opened the skin. There was no resistive scream, no flailing that would demand rapid fury from the operator. The procedure proceeded in a tempo that had, until then, been unimaginable, deliberate, measured, and, importantly, humane in a sense that was newly literal. As the wound was closed and Abbott regained full waking, the room moved from silent astonishment to a kind of stunned recognition. The object lesson had been given. Pain might be suspended by a controlled and temporary alteration of sensation. The consequences for surgery were immediate in the imagination of those present. What was the precise utterance that followed has become part of the lore. The familiar line, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug," is often attributed to the senior surgeon who performed the operation, spoken as if to close the argument forever. Yet the historian's work insists upon caution here. Contemporary documentary evidence does not record the phrase in the immediate surgical notes. The neat, triumphant sentence appears later in retellings and has been interrogated by modern scholars who ask whether history's remembered lines are sometimes the invention of a retelling eager for drama. That discrepancy itself is telling. It reminds us that the public life of a medical event is a construction, a mix of recorded fact, rhetorical flourish, and the human appetite for decisive sentences that close a debate. The uncertain provenance of the phrase does not diminish the reality of what occurred in that high-ceilinged room on that autumnal day. It only complicates the way memory and meaning conformed around the event. The demonstration altered more than operating technique. It altered reputations and alliances. Morton, for all his practical skill and conviction, was not an established physician. He belonged to a social world that moved between dental offices and chemical suppliers. Against that background, his emergence as the public proponent of ether provoked both admiration and suspicion. Some hailed the moment as the end of an era of cruelty. Others, more cautious, pointed to prior experiments and to the ethical dimension of introducing a new practice without the slow accretion of published observation. Questions that had been academic in less charged times, who was first, whose knowledge mattered, now became urgent and, as they often do in matters of credit and profit, bitter. The claim that a physician in Georgia had used ether as an anesthetic in an earlier surgery would surface in the records. The assertion that a chemist had suggested the use of ether to Morton would complicate claims of invention. These were not merely pedantic quarrels. They shaped public perceptions and, ultimately, the distribution of authority in the new field that was emerging around the control of surgical pain. Crawford Williamson Long, a country physician in Georgia, had indeed used sulfuric ether to remove a tumor in a neck operation years earlier. He had, however, delayed publication of his case until later, and that delay left the field open for those who made their demonstrations public. The difference between doing and publishing matters in the sciences. Discovery without dissemination is often a private triumph rather than a public revolution. Similarly, a chemist named Charles T. Jackson would later assert that he had suggested ether's use, a claim that would feed into a prolonged and bitter competition with Morton for priority and fortune. The conflicts that followed the public demonstration were therefore not simply quarrels over credit. They were disputes about how a new medical technique should be framed, as proprietary invention, as communal scientific advance, or as professional practice. The bitter edges of those arguments, and Morton's later attempts to patent and profit from his method under names that suggested commercial exclusivity, show how scientific breakthroughs so often enter a marketplace of reputation and resources as rapidly as they do the operating theater. There was also an immediate torrent of practical consequence. Reports of the public operation spread in medical journals, in newspapers, in letters, and surgeons who had long endured the ethical tension of causing pain for the sake of cure began to see alternatives to the old calculus. The metaphors that had justified haste and hardness, the necessary suffering, the trial by fire grew thin when a new mode of practice promised a tempering of suffering without the sacrifice of surgical possibility. As word moved outward from the amphitheater, requests arrived from hospitals and practitioners elsewhere to demonstrate the method. Ether, in short order, ceased to be a local curiosity and became the subject of an emergent discipline's first collective experiment. To learn how to give it, how to regulate its strength, how to combine it with the surgical craft. That collective work would remake the role of the operator and the patient, the technology of the operating room, and the moral grammar by which physicians justified their own actions. Yet the jubilant spread of ether also revealed the shadow that follows most rapid revolutions: human frailty, error, and human passions. Morton's attempts to patent his preparation, at one point nomming it with a trade-like term, angered colleagues who argued that remedies for human suffering should not be commodified. The attribution contests grew personal. Jackson's insistence on his own primacy and Long's quiet claim both complicated the simple narrative of invention. The lives of the principal actors after that day were not all gilded by triumph. Morton would spend years defending his claims and asserting rights. The shape of his later life included legal fights, public demands, and ultimately, a worn and contested reputation. These biographical aftershocks matter to the historian because they reveal how a public good, the silencing of surgical pain, can, in the wake of discovery, become entangled with private aims and public resentments. The ethical question, who profits from relief, remained as stubborn as any technical problem. And yet the practical achievement was not thereby nullified. For clinicians and patients alike, the demonstration in the dome did what demonstrations must do. It made an abstract possibility visible, reproducible, and imaginable. Surgeons who had once accepted pain as an inevitable part of their craft now had in front of them a way to imagine operations that were less hurried and more precise. Students who witnessed the scene learned to measure a procedure not only by speed, but by the skill of measured incision. Patients, too, began to see the hospital as a place where suffering could be negotiated rather than simply endured. The question that had haunted the preceding decades, could the body be made to sleep without sacrifice, now had an affirmative answer in public, albeit one that demanded refinement. As the crowd dispersed from the hospital that autumn, the city returned to its ordinary noises, yet the operating theaters of the world had been altered. The demonstration did not finish the story. It only made the new task unavoidable. The subsequent years would require not only the replication of the simple act witnessed in that dome, but the invention of standards, the training of practitioners, the explanation of mechanisms, and the navigation of moral claims that followed fame. Above all, surgeons would have to learn how to be both quick of hand and patient of skill, to slow when the knife needed to be careful, and to measure their craft against a new possibility. That pain need not be the currency of cure. In the wake of that day, several questions pressed more insistently than before. How would the new practice be taught so that it was safe and not merely theatrical? Which agents would prove to be not only effective but reliable and predictable across different bodies? Who would steward the technique? Enterprising individuals seeking recognition, chemists proposing formulas, or the emerging professional institutions that might standardize practice? The last of these questions would lead medicine into its next movement, not only towards different agents like chloroform and into debates about safety, but also into the slow, necessary work of converting a spectacle into a system. The ether dome had shown what was possible. The labor of professionalizing anesthesia had only begun. History often commends single days as turning points, and there is value in noting the moment when a possibility became public knowledge. Yet to treat that day as an ending would be to miss the richer drama, a series of overlapping lives and choices, experiments that proceeded on different timelines, and a culture that absorbed and resisted change in equal measure. The room under the dome had been the stage for a demonstration, but it was not, and could not be, the final authority. The demonstration posed questions wider than its space, about the distribution of credit, about the stewardship of remedies, and about the shape of surgical compassion. Those questions would be answered only slowly, in laboratories and lecture halls, in courtrooms, and in the quiet of hospital wards, and they would shape the moral architecture of modern medicine in ways the breath of one autumn morning could not immediately reveal. On the 4th of November in the year 1847, a small household experiment in Edinburgh folded into a public act whose echo would be heard around the world. In a modest room, a group of friends and colleagues, physicians, students, and acquaintances inhaled a volatile vapor, watched its effects, and registered astonishment. The chemist's notes, the laughter, the curious fall into a kind of dreamy insensibility. All of it was ordinary in a society that delighted in experimental spectacle. Yet what happened there was not mere diversion. Sir James Young Simpson, a physician and obstetrician who had been searching for gentler ways to shepherd women through childbirth, found in that vapor chloroform, a potency that promised not simply altered mood, but an ability to quiet bodily pain during operation. He and his circle carried that discovery into the wards and into obstetric practice, and the argument that pain could be deliberately suspended began to move from parlor curiosity to clinical claim. This was an experiment with moral weight as well as chemical novelty. Chloroform arrived at a particular cultural moment, a moment when the ideals of progress, compassion, and scientific mastery were pressing against older certainties that suffering had redemptive or disciplinary value. Simpson, who would later be remembered for promoting the agent's use in childbirth, did not simply demonstrate a technical trick. He issued a challenge to the social and ecclesiastical assumptions that had long governed the theater of pain. To put chloroform into a woman's lungs before the wrench of labor was, for many, an act that required public argument as much as clinical demonstration. The debate that followed in drawing rooms, pulpit admonitions, and medical societies was not only about safety. It was a quarrel about what it meant to relieve suffering at the moment of deepest human vulnerability. If Simpson's demonstrations made chloroform conceivable in polite and medical society, another figure set about to make its administration less capricious and more measured. John Snow, a physician whose name would later be associated with epidemiology, applied the analytic habits of the scientist to the practice of anesthesia. He studied the agent's action, designed more precise inhalers, and argued that dosing and delivery mattered as much as the agent itself. His careful attention to methodological detail and a temperament inclined to measurement made him a figure who could lend legitimacy to an unsettled practice. When, on the 7th day of April in the year 1853, He administered chloroform at the request of a sovereign, to ease the pains of a queen in labor. The act passed like a seal of public acceptance into a broader social conscience. The royal consent did not eliminate controversy, but it changed the social physics of debate. What had been experimental began to feel like responsible practice in the eyes of many. Yet the glow of royal approbation and the rhetoric of progress were shadowed quickly by tragedy. On the 28th day of January in the year 1848, a girl named Hannah Greener, admitted for a minor surgical removal of an ingrown nail, failed to revive after chloroform was administered. Her death became a public and painful symbol. The very agent that offered escape from the terror of incision could, under certain circumstances, extinguish life. Reports and inquiries followed. Clinicians and the public read the coroner's inquest with a kind of collective anxiety. The story of a youthful patient who never regained consciousness complicated the bold narrative of instant moral improvement. It forced the community of practitioners to confront the sobering fact that agents which plunged one body into temporary peace could depress breathing or trigger cardiac collapse in another. The event reframed the argument. The question was no longer simply whether it was right to relieve pain, but how to do so without introducing a new category of risk. That double movement, miraculous relief and the possibility of fatal harm, produced a set of debates that were technical, ethical, and social at once. Clinicians compared ether and chloroform, noting that chloroform acted faster and often more pleasantly, yet was at times less predictable in its effect. The medicinal literature and the newspapers filled with case reports, letters, and opprobrium. Parliamentary and ecclesiastical voices weighed in with moral objections and with calls for caution. For many practitioners, the calculus was immediate. Chloroform allowed surgery to be slower, to be controlled, to be more precise. For others, the unpredictability of individual reaction rendered it dangerous. The consequence was not uniform rejection or acceptance, but a period of contested practice in which practitioners adopted, adapted, and argued their way into new routines. What is striking is how quickly the controversy pushed technical creativity. The tragedies of early use generated invention, better mouthpieces and inhalers, careful observation of pulse and breathing, and protocols for administration that were the forerunners of later monitoring. Clinicians like John Snow argued that death and disaster could be limited by attention to dose, by slow induction, and by improvements in apparatus. The search for safer delivery methods became as urgent as the search for effective agents. Behind the practical inventiveness lay a deeper reorientation. Medicine now had to hold two truths together at once: that pain could be suspended, and that the act of suspending it carried its own distinct hazards. This dialectic shaped training, influenced who would be trusted to administer the breath of sleep, and slowly nudged the idea of anesthesia toward a distinct professional responsibility. The public life of chloroform also reveals the peculiar choreography of authority in 19th century medicine. When a technique promised relief, it could be celebrated as humane. When it produced deaths, it could be attacked as hubris. The actors in this drama were not only clinicians, but also journalists, priests, politicians, and patients themselves. A queen's use of chloroform reframed ethical argument into social practice. A single tragic death could inflame moral panic. A carefully written paper on technique could build a quiet trust. Over time, these forces produced the institutional arrangements that would govern anesthesia. Scientific journals that insisted on case reports and methods, professional meetings where demonstrations and arguments were held, and a growing expectation that those who administered the agent would possess particular knowledge and temperament. The accidental and the deliberate thus braided together to form practice. Amid these public and technical battles, other lines of inquiry were already opening that would diversify the means of relieving pain. The invention of local anesthetics, the discovery, decades later, that a topical alkaloid could numb tissue without rendering a patient unconscious, promised a different logic of pain control. The story of such local agents, sketched in the laboratories and clinics of the later 19th century, would show that anesthesia was not a single path, but a family of solutions, each with its own risks and virtues. That pluralization of technique mattered. It liberated practitioners from the binary choice of cut and suffer or sleep and risk, and suggested that the future of relieving pain would be multimodal and increasingly technical. What remained, as chloroform moved from experimental novelty to contested common use, was a core question that would shape the next era of the discipline. Who, precisely, should be entrusted with the patient's breath? The very act of transferring responsibility for the moment of insensibility, from the surgeon's quick hand to a measured administration of a chemical agent, implied a redistribution of authority in the operating room. Should the surgeon keep the duty to induce sleep, or should a specialist be trained to do so? Should the remedy be the property of an inventor, marketed and patented, or the shared technique of a professional community? The arguments that answered these questions would not simply determine who stood at the head of the theater. They would determine whether anesthetic practice became the province of isolated bravado or of systematic science. As the 19th century progressed, the story of chloroform became emblematic of a larger transformation. It was a story about the ethical aspiration to relieve suffering, about the messy realities of translating chemical possibility into predictable clinical practice, and about the social forces that confer legitimacy on new interventions. The agent's rapid adoption, its royal endorsement, and its tragic reverses taught medicine a difficult lesson. That technical power must be accompanied by institutional humility, by protocols, and by mechanisms for learning from failure. In the quiet of wards and in the roar of public debate, the contours of a new profession were being sketched. The theater of pain had been shown a way out. The long labor of turning that show into reliable practice was only beginning. At the close of this movement, the questions multiply rather than resolve. Could the apparatus of administration be made foolproof? Would professional training follow the new technical demands? How would society balance compassion and caution when the margin between relief and danger was sometimes so small? These questions are not theoretical. They would be answered in the slow accumulation of technique, in the painful corrections of practice, and in the institutional choices that give rise to specialties. The narrative of chloroform thus leaves us on a hinge. The triumph of a public demonstration and the grief of public tragedy together have forced medicine into a second, more disciplined phase, a phase in which the mercy of sleep must be married to the rigor of science. A new kind of courage took shape in the weary wards and anxious consulting rooms, not the courage of those who endured pain, but the courage of those who undertook to master the means of removing it. The middle decades of the 19th century became a theater in which triumph and catastrophe alternated so rapidly that clinicians, patients, and the reading public learned to expect both as part of a single story. The breath that had once promised only amusement or brief forgetfulness now carried with it the power to spare agony and the power to extinguish life. How then did a practice that had been hailed as a moral triumph so quickly become a source of deep public unease? The answer lies in the intimate, often brutal conjunction of technical novelty, human error, social appetite, and unresolved questions about who should steward a new, dangerous competence. The practical triumphs were immediate and persuasive. Where an operator could once only hope to be faster than the patient's cry, the introduction of inhaled agents allowed incision to be measured, not merely hurried. Surgeons experimented with Glover-like patients. They explored anatomical layers that had before been left untouched because the time needed to dissect with care would have been intolerable to the awake body. The imagination of surgery widened. Complex resections, reconstructive efforts, and delicate procedures, once impractical because of the patient's inevitable resistance, became thinkable. These possibilities fed a new professional energy. Hospitals convened meetings, medical journals published enthusiastic case reports, and students began to imagine a career in which skill could be expressed through both precision and compassion. Yet enthusiasm met a harsh empirical limit in a handful of grim episodes that riveted public attention. The death of a young patient could turn an otherwise technical discussion into a moral panic. The case most often invoked in that painful ledger was of a girl named Hannah Greener, who, during a seemingly minor operation to remove an ingrown nail, failed to recover after chloroform was given. The inquest into her death and the subsequent debates made visible an uncomfortable fact. The very medicine that promised to end suffering could also, under certain circumstances, cause sudden and inexplicable fatal collapse. The incident became a touchstone in public and professional conversations about risk, and it forced clinicians to accept that an agent's humane promise carried within it a deadly possibility that required explanation and control. This painful reality set several trains of response in motion. One was technical. Clinicians and inventors refined the instruments of administration. The crude napkins, conical mouthpieces, and improvised receptacles of the first experiments began to be replaced by devices designed to meter volatile agents, to moderate flow, and to allow the operator to suspend or reduce a dose quickly. Another response was procedural. Practitioners developed rules of induction and recovery, attentive to the patient's color, pulse, and respiratory rhythm in ways that had not been previously codified. A third response was intellectual. Physicians like John Snow insisted that the problem was not merely the agent but the method, and he set about to test, measure, and demonstrate techniques of controlled administration that reduced unpredictability. Snow's temperament favored quantification. His insistence on small inhalations and an apparatus that allowed for measured delivery became an argument for the clinician's responsibility to know what they were doing and to be trained in the technique. Such work did not make accidents impossible, but it did begin the slow transfer of anesthesia from improvisation to discipline. The social reverberations of these tragedies were complex. In the courts and the newspapers, questions were asked about responsibility and about the propriety of introducing new techniques without a community of trained specialists. Moral commentators, clerics, pamphleteers, and editorial writers debated whether it was right to remove suffering that might, in their view, carry spiritual or character significance. Others, more utilitarian in mind, argued that the capacity to relieve pain was a humane imperative that medicine had a duty to pursue, refining methods as necessary. The tug of war between prudence and progress often played out in public controversies about who should profit from such advances. When entrepreneurs or inventors tried to monetize the new techniques, moral outrage could be added to the list of professional objections. The commercialization of relief became a second source of turmoil. The inventor who most visibly courted both acclaim and censure was the dentist who had staged the famous public demonstration of ether. His attempt to attach a proprietary name to the preparation and to seek some legal protection for its manufacture created suspicion among many physicians who believed that methods for the relief of pain should be shared freely for the public good. The episode revealed that even the noblest discoveries quickly entered the marketplace of reputation and resources. Questions of credit, reward, and access were now entangled with basic clinical practice. The disputes that followed were not mere personality conflicts. They were structural contests that would influence whether anesthesia emerged as a communal technology or as a set of guarded techniques controlled by individuals and interests. Alongside arguments about ownership and safety ran another thread: the diversity of agents and the problem of choice. Chloroform often acted faster and with a certain apparent ease that made it attractive in obstetric and surgical contexts, yet it was, in some bodies, less predictable in effect. Ether was steadier but could induce nausea and prolonged recovery. Local agents, culminating in the discovery that a certain plant alkaloid could numb tissue at a point without rendering the whole body unconscious, were beginning to appear on the horizon, and with them the promise of a less global and therefore less risky approach to pain control. The first demonstrations that a topical solution could desensitize the cornea and allow eye surgery without full unconsciousness marked the dawn of a pluralistic approach to anesthesia. One size need not fit all, and the future would be manifold in its solutions. The arrival of local anesthetics offered a countervailing logic to the global sleep of inhaled agents, and it complicated the moral calculus by offering alternatives that were sometimes safer for particular procedures. What emerged from these tangled debates was a new recognition of professional responsibility. It became increasingly clear that the act of inducing insensibility was not a mere adjunct to surgery, but a distinct technical competency. The person who could calmly monitor breath and pulse while the scalpel ate into flesh would require not only manual skill, but also a temperament for observation, a knowledge of pharmacological effects, and a commitment to methodical practice. The realization that anesthesia might be a distinct line of expertise laid the groundwork for later institutional arrangements. The creation of societies that sought standards of practice, the establishment of educational paths, and, eventually, the formalization of a specialty. Those institutional answers were slow to arrive, but the questions they addressed were born in the turbulence of these years. The voice of the patient, which had been largely muffled in earlier eras by the necessities of rapid operation, began to be heard with new force. Patients now asked not only whether an operation could cure, but whether it could be performed without memorable terror. The demand for gentler methods influenced the spread of anesthetic technique, not merely out of scientific curiosity, but because people began to choose hospitals and practitioners on the basis of perceived humanity in care. That social pressure, combined with technical improvements and professional debate, formed an array of incentives that accelerated the refinement of practice. Medicine was learning that ethical and reputational factors could be as powerful as technical ones in shaping what counted as acceptable care. All the while, the public drama of the period, the heroics, the tragedies, the legal fights, made clear that progress is rarely a straight line. A demonstration in a great amphitheater might change surgical imagination in a day. Practices and safety protocols would not consolidate in a decade. The cost of innovation in human bodies became an ethical burden that the profession had to accept, to document, and to learn from. The question, repeated in pamphlet and paper, was urgent and pragmatic. How could a technique that saved so much suffering be taught and regulated so that it would harm as little as possible? The answer, slowly and imperfectly, was to build systems. Journals began to demand fuller reports of technique and outcome. Institutions convened to examine methods. Clinicians who traveled carried both instruments and protocols from one hospital to another. The collective laboratory of practice, sometimes messy, often painful, became the place where errors were corrected, where devices were standardized, and where norms of competence were argued into existence. It was in this collaborative but contested space that anesthesia began to shed its character as a thrilling novelty, and to take on the weighty character of a discipline. By the time the 19th century drew toward its close, the consequences of those turbulent middle years were visible. The emergency of a specialist role, the diversification of agents, the insistence on measured administration, and the bitter public disputes over credit and risk had together transformed a cluster of experiments into an enterprise with moral and institutional shape. But the landscape was still rent with unresolved questions about access, about who profited from relief, and about how to balance compassion with caution. The tumult of triumphs and tragedies had not only made anesthesia inevitable, it had made the pursuit of safer, more reliable practice an ethical imperative. As surgeons and physicians closed their casebooks at the end of a long day, they were haunted less by the memory of successful operations than by the knowledge that each patient's breath held both promise and peril. The history of those years insists on a difficult lesson. That technical power without shared standards and without collective humility invites both wonder and grief. The next movement of the story, a movement toward training, regulation, and the slow birth of anesthesiology as a distinct science, will be shaped by the very turmoil and triumphs recounted here. The work of turning sporadic success and painful failure into a reliable, humane practice had only just begun. There comes a moment in every practical revolution when the atmosphere in the room changes. The work that was once improvisation becomes a craft. The tinkering bench turns into a workshop. The lonely experiment becomes the subject of training and regulation. In the decades after the breath that stilled Edward Abbott in the Great Dome, that slow movement gathered force. What had begun as convivial inhalations, daring demonstrations, and a few brilliant improvisations now pointed toward infrastructures, devices, methods, societies, and schools that would convert an episodic miracle into a durable medical practice. This is the story of how anesthesia ceased to be an ad hoc art and became a recognized technical profession. A story of apparatus and apprenticeship, of measurement and monitoring, of personalities who taught and institutions that slowly learned to govern the patient's most fragile instant, the suspension of sensation. If we fasten on a single figure as emblematic of the transition from charm to discipline, John Snow stands in the foreground. He was not merely a skilled clinician. He was a laborious empiricist who sought to translate intuition into repeatable method. He insisted that inhaled agents were not mystic potions, but substances whose effects could be observed, measured, and controlled. His contributions are concrete. He devised inhalers that allowed a clinician to moderate the concentration of vapor. He recorded careful case notes, and he advanced the idea that the skill of administering an anesthetic required temperament as much as technique. When a monarch in the year 1853 asked to be relieved in labor, and when Snow performed that delicate public task for Queen Victoria, the act radiated social legitimacy. But the deeper consequence lay in the quiet insistence that administration could be systematized and taught. Snow's practice set the model. The breath is both simple and perilous. It should be handled by a competent hand. At the same time, inventors turned clinical anxiety into mechanical problem solving. Early inhalers and cloths were replaced, gradually, with graduated devices intended to control dose and reduce surprise. Joseph Thomas Clover, a London physician whose name recurs through photographic collections and technical descriptions, invented a regulating chloroform apparatus in the year 1862 that made the administration of volatile agents less capricious. His designs, heavy, deliberate, and often photographed in the wards of the time, were attempts to place a measure where once there had been only feeling. Clover's machines did not render anesthesia risk-free, but they reoriented practice toward measured delivery and away from the improvisatory rituals of folded cloths and dampened sponges. The device was a statement. If you could measure the medicine, you might also limit the harm. That aspiration to render anesthesia measurable found broader expression in the slow evolution of the anesthetic machine itself. The passage from individual gadgetry to more complex apparatus culminated in designs that integrated gas supplies, flow control, and rudimentary monitoring. The machine that would become ubiquitous in operating rooms the world over was not born whole. It accreted part by part. The modifications made by a British engineer in the year 1917 on earlier American designs gave rise to what is commonly known as the Boyle machine, a continuous flow anesthetic apparatus that standardized the delivery of oxygen and volatile agents, and provided the clinician with valves and gauges by which inhalation could be regulated. A machine is always more than metal. It is the visible manifesto of a profession that has decided to measure, to document, and to minimize avoidable variance. The Boyle apparatus and the devices that preceded and followed it anchored an expectation that the act of anesthesia would be mediated by instruments as much as by the practitioner's hand. Machines demanded users and users demanded instruction. The rapid spread of anesthetic technique in hospitals and in wartime theaters exposed a practical problem. Who would be trained to administer the breath of sleep? At first, administration was a responsibility shared among a motley cast. The surgeon, a medical student, a nurse, or sometimes an inspired attendant. The variability in outcomes and the increasing complexity of choke points in equipment and dosing stimulated an organizational response. In the United States and in Europe, practitioners began to gather in societies where papers were read, apparatus compared, and methods argued into consensus. The Long Island Society of Anesthetists, formed in the year 1905, is one early example of clinicians choosing collective self-definition over ad hoc practice. Such societies were not merely clubs. They were the crude beginnings of credentialing, of apprenticeship, and of the ethical norm that those who assume responsibility for another person's respiration must be trained, supervised, and answerable to a community of peers. Institutional growth brought the slow elaboration of curricula and of ritual. Hospitals that once prized the swiftness of the surgeon now found cause to create rotations, lectures, and demonstration wards where the practice of anesthesia could be observed, practiced, and corrected. The pedagogy was both practical and epistemic. Students learned to read skin, to count respirations, to listen for the small sigh that becomes the collapse of life. They learned to titrate a vapor based on visible signs rather than on bravado. Those lessons were sometimes taught the hard way, in the crucible of error and inquests, and they were sometimes formalized by careful manuals and published case series. The transformation was not only in technique, but in professional identity. To be an anesthetist came to mean possessing a specific, bounded domain of expertise with attendant responsibilities and standards. The technological turn also catalyzed improvements in monitoring. Early practitioners relied on the senses: look at the color of the skin, feel for the pulse, listen for the breath. But the clinical tragedies and near misses of mid-century practice spurred inventions and protocols to catch the first signs of trouble. Recording of pulse and respiration, the use of simple manometers, and the later introduction of blood pressure measurement were incremental but decisive moves toward what we now call perioperative monitoring. These were not glamorous innovations. They were the slow accretion of safety culture. Each additional instrument or observation checklist reduced the mystique of the moment and replaced it with a distributed set of checks, a choreography in which the clinician's eye, the nurse's note, and the machine's gauge each played a role. The impulse was ethical as well as technical. If medicine now possessed the means to reduce avoidable harm, then it had an obligation to do so. Professionalization changed the social geography of the operating room, where once the surgeon stood as sovereign, often directing every element of the operation. There emerged a division of labor in which anesthesia came to demand a distinct competence. This redistribution of authority was not simply practical, it was also political. It raised questions about status, training pathways, and the rightful seat at the theater's head. In some places, surgeons resisted. In others, they delegated willingly, relieved to have a trained colleague attend the patient's breath. Over time, the formation of colleges and certification boards made the new role institutional. Titles, examinations, and professional societies turned an emergent technique into a regulated specialty with enforceable standards and shared ethics. The First World War and the conflicts that followed accelerated the process. The trauma of mass surgery placed enormous demands on anesthetic services and forced improvisation into disciplined logistics. Young doctors and nurses, pressed into service, carried machines and techniques across theaters of war, testing them under pressure and returning with modifications. War, in this grim sense, acted as an intense laboratory that clarified best practice and exposed the cost of inconsistency. In the calmer years that followed, those wartime lessons fed into the curricula of peacetime hospitals. into equipment standards, and into national conversations about who should be permitted to induce and manage anesthesia. Yet professionalization did not erase the human questions that had first animated the breath of change. Who would have access to refined anesthesia and its safety systems? Would the technology create new inequalities between hospitals that could afford machines and those that could not? How would the profession guard against the commodification of relief while still encouraging innovation? These questions shadowed the development of institutions even as they legitimized them. Training and standardization provided partial answers, but access remained uneven and contested for many decades. By the time the century turned, and the machines on wheeled trolleys became a familiar sight beside the operating table, the culture of medicine had altered markedly. Anesthesia was no longer merely a method but a domain, an assemblage of devices, practices, ethical expectations, and professional identities. The patient's breath was no longer something to be hurried past. It was an active focus of care, a situated responsibility shared by a team and supported by instruments. That reorientation reshaped surgery itself. Procedures that had been perilous because of the pain they inflicted were now technically feasible. The boundary of what clinicians could attempt expanded with the proportions of the machines on their carts and the competence of the hands that tended to the breath. As this movement matured, the narrative of invention and adoption settled into a quieter, institutional rhythm. Societies published standards, schools taught technique, engineers refined vaporizers, and clinicians measured outcomes with increasing care. The drama of demonstration had given way to the discipline of practice. Yet the earlier contests remained instructive. The debates about patents and proprietorship, the tragedies that taught new rules, and the civic insistence that anesthesia be both humane and safe all continued to shape the emerging specialty. The question that now propelled the work was less dramatic but more consequential: how to make a fragile moment, the suspension of sensation, as reliably ordinary and as predictably safe as the suturing of a closed wound. The answer would be pursued not in single great days, but in the slow architecture of machines, curricula, and communities of practice that together converted breath into care. In the next movement of our narrative, the focus turns to the spread of specific techniques, the arrival of local anesthetics that offered alternatives to whole-body sleep, and the modernization of monitoring that, by the 20th century's mid-decades, would alter the risk calculus of every operation. The story of professionalization has done its work. It made possible the safe extension of surgery's ambition. But it also left us with a delicate truth, one that will return again and again in the tale that follows. Every new capacity to relieve suffering brings with it a responsibility to measure, to teach, and to guard, forever attentive to the breath that gives life to human hope. Operating rooms that once echoed with hurried commands and the raw music of blunt instruments had, by the middle of the 20th century, acquired a different kind of sound. The muted hiss of regulated gas, the rhythmic blinking of instruments, the low, steady commentary of a clinician who watched a machine as closely as a pulse. This movement from improvisation to engineered reliability did more than change technique. It altered the very possibilities of surgical imagination. Surgeons planned longer procedures. Teams rehearsed complex sequences. Patients could be offered operations that, in an earlier age, would have been unthinkable because of the cruelty of pain or the limits of control. Yet this modernizing arc carried its own paradox. The safer anesthesia became, in many technical respects, the more patients and clinicians believed they had mastered the problem, and the more new, subtle problems came into view. The practical advances that marked this era were manifold and cumulative. New inhalational agents were developed that were less irritating to the airway and more predictable in their onset and recovery. Intravenous drugs that induced rapid sleep allowed an induction that was swift and, when properly managed, smoother than the clumsy practices of earlier decades. Pharmaceutical chemistry produced drugs that could be titrated with a degree of precision previously unimaginable. Paralytic drugs, used to relax muscle during certain operations, allowed surgeons to work in fields that had once resisted access. Each innovation enlarged the surgical repertoire. Heart chambers could be entered, tumors could be excised with painstaking reconstruction, and the promise of organ transplantation began to emerge from the horizon of possibility. But technical change alone does not explain the transformation. What changed most deeply was the integration of monitoring into the act of care. Clinicians moved from relying solely on sight, touch, and crude instruments to embracing electronic measures that rendered the patient's internal state visible in continuous graphs and numbers. The electrocardiograph that recorded the heart's electrical rhythm became an essential companion to the anesthetist. Devices that measured blood pressure and later oxygen saturation added further layers of feedback. These instruments did not replace clinical judgment, they extended it. A shrill alarm, the subtle drop of a waveform, the faint change in color on a screen. Such signs became the language by which teams averted harm before it became irreversible. Practice, therefore, shifted from reactive rescue to anticipatory control. Anticipate a problem and adjust the breath or the dose before crisis arrived. Consider a scene in a modern theater to make this concrete. A patient enters the room in the soft light. Family goodbyes end in the corridor. Inside, the air smells faintly of antiseptic and machine oil. The anesthetist greets the patient by name, checks the chart, and speaks in steady sentences while the nurse prepares lines and monitors. A mask is applied. A breath is delivered. Sleep arrives within a measured set of inhalations or a programmed infusion. Tubes glint. Monitors wink. The surgeon makes the opening incision with a confidence that is not arrogance but the product of shared vigilance. If a subtle decline in oxygen saturation appears, the team responds with a practiced choreography, adjust ventilation, check lines, treat cause. The patient's body is surrounded by competence. Machines calibrated to the task, clinicians trained to read their instruments, protocols that distribute responsibility. The scene is, above all, a choreography of safety. That choreography was not inevitable. It was the result of decades of incremental work, better vaporizers and pumps, more dependable agents, the diffusion of clinical training, and the slow cultural acceptance that reducing variability saves lives. It was also the work of standardization. Professional bodies published guidelines, surgical centers adopted checklists, perioperative teams rehearsed responses to cardiac arrest and airway obstruction. The language of risk assessment, the idea that a patient's comorbidities and the planned procedure should guide the choice of agent and monitoring level, became central. The operating theater was remade into a high-reliability environment where redundancies and backups were intentionally built into care. As anesthesia became safer in developed centers, its global footprint grew. Techniques that had been pioneered in great teaching hospitals crossed oceans in the pockets of traveling physicians, the pages of journals, and the donors' shipments of equipment. In some places, the change was rapid and transformative. Hospitals that had been mere clinics acquired wards capable of major surgery. Surgical programs multiplied. Mortality from procedures that had once implied terrible odds dropped. Yet the spread was uneven. Many regions remained short of trained people and calibrated machines, and in those places, the older calculus of speed, improvisation, and limited analgesia persisted. Thus, a new ethical question took shape alongside the technical one: how to ensure that the benefits of safer anesthesia would not be confined to a fortunate minority. The distribution of competence and equipment became a moral problem as much as a logistical one. The modern era also confronted new clinical puzzles. As overall safety improved, rare and troubling phenomena emerged into view. One such problem was intraoperative awareness, the experience, in which a small number of patients later reported being conscious during parts of an operation despite being given anesthetic drugs. For the patient who recounted it, the memory could be vivid and traumatic: a voice without understanding, a sense of being trapped while instruments moved. For clinicians, the phenomenon posed a hard practical question: how to ensure that levels of anesthesia were adequate for each person, given individual variation in sensitivity and metabolism. The answer demanded better monitoring, tools that could assess cerebral activity rather than only peripheral surrogates, as well as a humility about the variability of human responses to drugs. Another set of concerns was systemic, postoperative complications that related indirectly to anesthesia, such as respiratory depression after the patient returned to the ward, or the complex interplay between anesthetic technique and pain control after major procedures. Pain management itself moved into the foreground as a distinct discipline. The recognition that preventing acute pain from becoming chronic required attention in the immediate postoperative hours, and that multimodal techniques, combining regional blocks, non-opioid medications, and careful assessment, could improve long-term outcomes. The clinical questions thus broadened from the single dramatic instant of induction to the patient's entire perioperative journey. Technological innovation continued apace. The latter half of the 20th century and the opening decades of the next one saw the introduction of devices that could continuously measure oxygenation at the level of peripheral blood, of monitors that displayed end-tidal concentrations of anesthetic vapor, and of infusion pumps that could deliver drugs with remarkable precision. Each device reframed practice. Clinicians had new data to interpret and new opportunities to prevent harm. At the same time, the profusion of technology raised new challenges about dependence and training. A clinician who had to interpret a dozen variables under time pressure required not only technical knowledge, but also cognitive skills in triage and in the prioritization of responses. The profession responded by developing systems of care that integrated human and machine. Simulation training became common. Teams rehearsed rare emergencies in mock operating rooms. Checklists and debriefs were used to capture learning from both successes and complications. Institutional morbidity and mortality conferences continued a long medical tradition, but with a modern emphasis on system faults rather than individual blame. The ethos that emerged was one of continuous improvement. Treat every complication as an opportunity to refine protocols, to redesign equipment interfaces, or to adjust staffing models. Across these decades, the social meaning of anesthesia continued to evolve. Patients came to expect not only freedom from pain during surgery, but also a measured recovery and an attention to postoperative comfort. The experience of anesthesia shaped trust. Patients who perceived a team as careful with monitoring and communication were more likely to accept complex operations. Public expectations even influenced research agendas. As society demanded shorter hospital stays and quicker returns to function, clinicians and industry pursued agents and techniques that minimized cognitive side effects and hastened recovery. The ethical scaffolding of practice deepened as well. Institutional review boards and informed consent procedures became central. Patients were educated about the risks and benefits of anesthetic options, and clinicians were expected to share the uncertainties that remained. The profession also wrestled with resource allocation, how to prioritize scarce monitoring devices in lower resource settings, how to train enough practitioners to serve rural hospitals, and how to maintain standards in environments where supply chains faltered. These were not merely administrative problems. They were questions about the rights of patients to safe, measured relief of pain. Finally, the scientific frontier advanced into subtler domains. Investigations into the long-term cognitive effects of anesthesia in the elderly, explorations of how genetic variants influence drug sensitivity, and experiments with targeted regional techniques that could render large parts of the body insensitive without affecting consciousness. Each frontier carried promise and uncertainty. The narrative of progress, therefore, did not end in triumphant closure. It moved into a phase of disciplined inquiry, where the old questions of mercy and risk were reframed by new methods of measurement and by the language of evidence. As the 20th century unfurled into the 21st, then, anesthesia stood as a paradox resolved and a challenge renewed. The theater of pain had been fundamentally altered. Operations that once required breathless haste were now exercises in collective control and precaution. Yet the conquest of pain had not produced a final mastery. It had unveiled layers of complexity, physiological, technological, ethical, and social, that required continual attention. The story of modern milestones is thus not a tale of final victory, but of disciplined stewardship. The profession had learned to build instruments and institutions that could reduce obvious harms, and now faced the more delicate work of making the benefits widely accessible, of understanding subtle harms that remained, and of sustaining humility before the variability of human bodies. A question shadows this movement forward as we prepare to close our historical arc. Having made anesthesia safer, more precise, and more global in reach, what responsibilities follow? Who will carry the duty to extend these advances equitably across societies? How will the next generation of clinicians balance technological abundance with the simple, human tasks of listening, observing, and comforting? These are not rhetorical flourishes, but practical imperatives. The next and final movement will take up the legacy of anesthesia, its cultural meanings, its ethical dilemmas, and the shape of its future, and ask how the hard-won gains of 2 centuries might be preserved and extended in a world still at risk of unequal access to relief. The story returns, as good narratives do, to the faces that first gave it urgency: the patient in the theater, the surgeon with steady hands, the practitioner who learned to measure breath as if it were a sacred duty. 2 centuries of experiment, dispute, invention, and institutional labor have left us with a paradox both simple and deep. Medicine has, in large measure, delivered on the old, audacious promise to make cutting painless. At the same time, the work of humane, reliable anesthesia remains forever unfinished. To reckon with that double fact is to place the technical achievements beside their moral shadow, to hold triumph and obligation together, and to ask what we must preserve and what we must still attempt. When the first public demonstrations of ether and the quick, regal acceptances of chloroform made silence possible in the operating room, the immediate effect was almost palpable. Fear retreated from the bedside, and the imagination of surgeons widened. The breath that once signaled only vulnerability became an instrument of possibility. Over the long sweep of the 19th and 20th centuries, clinicians and engineers built machines, formulated methods, and created trainings that turned a capricious art into a disciplined science. Monitors that look for the faintest flattening of a waveform, vaporizers that deliver a steady concentration of agent, and protocols that insist on checklists and team communication are not merely conveniences. They are the institutional memory of the many small lessons learned when a life hung, for a moment, on the precision of a hand or the reliability of a gauge. Professional societies, textbooks, and teaching wards codified what once had been crafted into a body of shared competence. Yet the arc of history does not end with invention. It bends toward questions of justice and scale. In the year 2015, a global reckoning named a blunt and uncomfortable reality. Roughly 5 billion people across the world lacked access to safe, affordable surgical and anesthetic care when needed. That statistic is not an abstraction, but a map of unequal lives, of patients in distant clinics who still face the calculus of pain and haste, of hospitals that cannot count on continuous oxygen or a functioning monitor, and of families denied procedures that other patients take for granted. The revolution that made complex, humane surgery possible in some places had not reached many others. The technologies and the trained hands were distributed unevenly across geography and wealth. The moral question that follows is not merely how to invent better tools, but how to deliver those tools, and the training to use them, to the many millions who remain at the margins of safe care. Acts of practical generosity and institutional ingenuity have answered that question in part. One of the clearest and most concrete examples is the global effort to put pulse oximeters into every operating room. The simple device, which measures the oxygenation of the blood and the patient's pulse, is singled out in international standards as a minimum requirement for safe anesthesia. Yet for many years it was absent in low-resource settings. An initiative that combined appropriate technology with training distributed tens of thousands of robust oximeters and taught clinicians how to interpret and act on their readings. Those donations and that education changed outcomes in hospital wards where previously there had been none of the continuous physiological feedback that clinicians in wealthier centers had long relied upon. The effort shows an important truth. Sometimes the most urgent need is not a novel drug or an exotic machine, but a reliable instrument paired with human instruction and durable supply chains. The ethical architecture of modern anesthesia rests on three linked pillars: competence, monitoring, and access. Competence demands that those who tend the breath possess both knowledge and the temperament of careful observation. Monitoring supplies the continuous data that turn judgment into demonstrable action, and access insists that those competencies and technologies be available to all who need them, not only those who can pay. Professionalization and improved equipment have reduced anesthetic mortality dramatically in settings where they are routine. The challenge now is to make the same baseline of safety universal. This is a technical problem and a political one. Hospitals, ministries of health, professional bodies, and civil society must collaborate to create training pipelines, maintenance programs for equipment, and financing models that do not make safety a luxury. There is also a subtler cultural legacy to consider. The conquest of pain did more than enable longer operations. It altered how society understands suffering, agency, and dignity. Where earlier ages accepted pain as inevitable or morally freighted, modern medicine treats its reduction as an ethical imperative. That shift has reverberations beyond the operating theater. It shapes how we think about childbirth, chronic pain, palliative care, and even the way patients expect to be treated in health systems. Yet every moral advance invites scrutiny. When relief becomes available unevenly, questions of fairness sharpen. When new techniques create new side effects or dependencies, questions of prudence awaken. The history of anesthesia, therefore, reads as a lesson in humility. Technical success must be matched by ethical imagination. The same human compassion that sought to abolish needless agony must now attend to how benefits are distributed and harms anticipated. Looking forward, the domain of anesthesia faces technical frontiers and social ones at once. On the technical side, research into tailored anesthesia, guided by genetics, by more sophisticated brain monitoring, and by drug formulations that minimize long-term cognitive effects, promises to make care more precise. Regional techniques that numb targeted parts of the body without rendering the whole person unconscious continue to develop, offering options that balance safety and comfort for many procedures. On the social side, greater emphasis falls on building resilient systems, supply chains for oxygen and monitoring, scalable training programs for clinicians and technicians, and data systems that measure outcomes so that improvements can be iterated. None of these advances are automatic. Each requires funding, political will, and professional governance to convert possibility into routine practice. If the 19th century question was whether pain could be made negotiable, the 21st century question is how to make that negotiation universal and sustainable. That requires a dual humility: the humility to accept that a technical fix is not enough, and the humility to listen to those working in resource-limited settings about practical priorities. It also requires an honest reckoning with the marketplace. Inventions flourish when they are rewarded, But the commodification of relief can twist priorities if markets alone determine access. Public goods, training programs, standards for safe practice, maintenance networks for equipment must be sustained by collective will, not left solely to profit motives. History leaves us with a few clear lessons about how to do this work. First, demonstrations and inventions change imagination. They make the impossible visible. But making an intervention safe and equitable requires slow, often unglamorous work. Training, standardization, quality control, and attention to supply chains. Second, appropriate technology matters. Devices designed for fragile environments and accompanied by training often save more lives than cutting-edge machines ill-suited to local realities. Third, professional community is a bulwark against error. Societies, journals, and quality frameworks turn discrete success into shared competence. The past shows that these are the levers by which private triumphs become public goods. We must also remember the human stories that began this long arc. The anonymous patient who once lay bound to a wooden table and the operator who learned to slow his hand both stand within the same moral lineage as the clinician who today monitors a waveform and a technician who fixes a donated monitor in a distant hospital. The breath that once signaled only fear has become an index of care, and that transformation is nothing less than a moral achievement. Yet achievements demand stewardship. The obligation now is to sustain the conditions that make modern anesthesia not a privilege but a standard. Safe devices, trained hands, robust systems, and the political will to see equitable access as an element of humane society. So we close not with a tidy moral, but with a set of charges carried forward from century to century. Keep the instruments clean and the gauges calibrated. Teach the next generation to listen to breath as well as to numbers. Design devices for fragility as well as for abundance. Argue fiercely about who profits from relief and quietly about how to distribute it fairly. Remember that a single demonstration can change imagination, but that durable change takes patient, institutional labor. The revolution that began with a singular inhalation under a high dome has remade the body's relation to pain. It has widened the field of what surgeons and patients may ask of one another. It has taught medicine that compassion can be engineered into practice, but also that engineering without justice will leave many wanting. If history has any practical gift for us, it is this: the lesson that technical possibility binds us to responsibility. The breath that once carried only terror now carries an ethical weight, and that weight asks of every clinician, every policymaker, and every community one simple thing: do not let the mercy of modern anesthesia be the privilege of a few when it can, with effort and imagination, be the right of all.